Thank you very much, Michael, and good morning, everybody. Yeah, this is not a debate. It really will be, I hope, a search for understanding and a search for truth, and I can't imagine two more able facilitators in this search that we're all undergoing. So let me just start with just building on Michael's opening. 3 months into the second Trump administration, talks are underway with the stated purpose of denying the Iranian regime nuclear weapons capability in return for a lifting of U.S. sanctions. At least that's what appears to be underway. The administration has sent mixed signals on the full extent of its objectives in the 3 rounds of negotiations that began 2 weeks ago in Oman, perhaps to keep its adversary off balance or to keep expectations from climbing to unrealistic heights. The U.S. may be pursuing a wider deal, choking the regime's further development of ballistic missiles and its support for a network of terrorist proxies, in addition to the so-called full dismantlement of Iran's sophisticated uranium enrichment capacity and the elimination of its enriched uranium stockpile. Or Washington may be limiting its aims to allowing but sharply limiting uranium enrichment enforced by a robust international inspection regime. We've heard conflicting signals, as you know. So let's begin by asking our experts what they make of the current administration's approach in these talks with Iran, its objectives, its chances of success, the degree to which other interested parties, particularly Israel, are being consulted and are concurring with Washington, and the format that is being followed. And I think, Elliott, I'll begin with you.
Thank you. And thank you all for, I should say, inviting me here today and being here with them. I fear to say that you'll find us in agreement on too many things, so it won't be like last night. In the first term, Trump pursued the so-called maximum pressure campaign. But remember what that was. It was an effort to get a negotiated agreement. It was not, for better or worse, it was not an effort to overthrow the regime. It was to get a deal. And I think he's pursuing that again. He wants a negotiated deal. As in Gaza, as in Ukraine, he wants a negotiated deal. The question that I think we can't answer, and in your opening statement, you know, there were rightly a number of perhaps and maybe and could, because we don't know. We know very little about the negotiations that are underway now. The question, I think, is what terms would the president accept? I'm not comforted by what I've seen so far. If you look at, say, Witkoff and Putin, Witkoff and Ukraine, he looks willing to accept terms that I would call too weak. Now, is that Witkoff or is that Trump? Same thing with respect to Iran. I think part of the problem is, at least until now, there's no negotiating team. There's Mr. Witkoff, who has no background on these issues, versus the Iranians, who have literally decades of experience with this negotiation. But the ultimate question is, what are the terms that the president would accept and what are the terms that he would turn down and say, that's not good enough, do better, or you know where we're heading? And I think we just don't know the answer to that yet.
Suzanne?
Hello? Oh, it's working. Thank you all, and thanks, Elliott, for setting up this conversation in such a positive way. I think we will find lots of areas of agreement. You know, I think we can take heart that there's actually some responsiveness from the Iranians in terms of coming back to the negotiating table. The Biden administration cajoled and begged and pleaded for many months to try to get a negotiation underway with the Iranians, and that set the stage, I think, for a fairly imbalanced dynamic between the two parties and relatively limited opportunity for real progress. So I think what the Trump administration did successfully in its very early weeks was to create a set of circumstances in which the Iranians saw both the opportunity and the threat being the movement of a lot of US military materiel to the Gulf, and to the wider region, even at a time when the president and his administration are fairly transparent about not wanting to get dragged into another long-term and costly conflict in the Middle East. But they showed some muscle. They're hitting back hard against the Houthis. How successful that will be, I'm not so sure. But it does send a signal to Tehran that there are consequences and that the United States is not going to simply be begging for talks with no real recriminations or retaliation. I do worry that the Iranians think that they have an easy mark, that Mr. Witkoff has the trust and confidence of the president, but he does not have, as Elliott said, much detailed knowledge of the nuclear industry or Iran's particular nuclear file. And as we know, the prior 2015 deal, of which there were many critics, took 2.5 years to negotiate, was 157 pages of very densely detailed text. And even with a team now of experts who are meeting with Iranian experts, as Elliott said, it's not clear that this is going to be a successful negotiation from the American side, because the Iranians have so much experience in, sort of putting forward their own agenda in a way that they have successfully imposed upon their negotiating partners. I think what many people assume is that there may be some kind of an interim agreement, as there was during the Obama administration, an agreement that at least pauses some of Iran's very dangerous progress on the nuclear file, the enrichment at very high levels, the rollback of inspections and monitoring, and then create space for a more detailed negotiation that would actually get to the heart of the matter. But I do worry that both sides want better than they got in 2015. The United States, it's been a little unclear from the administration, but I think the current position is that the Iranians should have no enrichment whatsoever. That's something that prior administrations tried and failed to impose on Iran, and I think they're going to be even less successful today when Iran has a fairly sizable stockpile of enriched uranium and a very significant number of centrifuges at a very advanced level. The Iranians, from their side, want something better as well. They want durable guarantees of sanctions relief, which, of course, was not possible in the prior deal. And so I think the fact that we're raising the bar, that we have less experienced negotiators, does not leave me terribly confident.
Let's talk about the implications of an interim deal and the dangers of an interim deal, given the timelines that we're all under. And Elliott, let me start with you.
Well, the danger is that you get an interim deal that lasts forever. The old line about nothing is more permanent than a temporary agreement.
The world's most experienced, wiliest negotiators.
The danger is that this window closes. There is an opportunity here. Let's be blunt. There's an opportunity to strike the Iranian nuclear program militarily, because the Israelis largely destroyed their air defenses. Over time, they'll rebuild those air defenses. Whether you think it's a year, or 2 years, 3 years, with the help of presumably the Russians and Chinese, they'll rebuild them. So this is the window, 2025. If you get an interim agreement, you're freezing, for one thing, the Israeli ability to do that. If the president says to the Israelis, don't strike now, we're negotiating, let's see what comes out of it, okay? Then you get an interim deal, and now we're negotiating a permanent deal. This is great for Iran, because the enforcer, the person who says to Israel, don't do it, becomes Donald Trump. And that is actually, I would say, disastrous. That, I think, is the problem of any kind of interim deal. If we should force the Iranians to make hard choices now, give up this nuclear weapons program, or pay the penalty. An interim deal lets them escape.
And there's another deadline, of course, which is the October 18th deadline for the expiration of the ability to snap back the sanctions that were imposed by the United Nations. So an interim deal might just drag us past that deadline, in which case then we really lose a great deal of leverage. Suzanne, I want to pick up on something that you were saying earlier. In the 2014-2015 nuclear negotiations with Iran under President Obama, a line was crossed in which the Iranian regime was ceded, as you're pointing out, the right to enrich uranium, a right no country is guaranteed under the 1970 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement, to which Iran is a party. There are calls now from skeptics who doubt Iran's intention to abide by any agreement it signs, that continuing to allow any degree of enrichment will be a fatal flaw, that all of Iran's centrifuges and its entire and extensive nuclear infrastructure has to be destroyed. Is that achievable, that goal of bringing them back to a point where they no longer have the right, as they see it, to enrich? Given the fact that the machinery can more easily be destroyed than the knowledge in the minds of Iranian nuclear scientists and engineers, is it even enduringly effective to carry out so-called full dismantlement?
I think it would be a tremendous challenge. The Iranian program is highly advanced, and it has made enormous strides since President Trump walked away from the agreement in 2018. We don't know what we don't know about the program in terms of the centrifuge production and deployment, and to what extent Iran has been able to build up more of a secret program than we are fully aware of because of the lack of the fully comprehensive inspections and verification by the International Atomic Energy Agency since 2019. And I think that this has always been the conundrum from the first disclosures of the Iranian program 23 years ago till today. The original intent during the first Bush administration was to try to persuade the Iranians to forego enrichment entirely, and they agreed to do that for a short period of time. But since 2005, they've been completely unwilling to do that. And I think it's a question both for the negotiators, but also for those who might consider a military strike, to what extent we can be confident that any efforts to push back Iran's program wouldn't simply result in a race toward a bomb, that the price that they have paid over these 2 decades for this program demonstrates the commitment that they have and also the investment that they have made in something that they consider, the regime's leadership considers existential for the country and for their continuing hold on the country. And so I think that, it's going to be very difficult to achieve a full denuclearization of Iran at the negotiating table. I think it may be very difficult to do that even through strikes as well.
I think this shows the fraudulence of the Iranian position. I think you're exactly right. But, what are they doing? They're building a nuclear weapon. No country has ever enriched uranium to 60% and not gone on to build a weapon. They don't need 60% or 40% or 10% enrichment for nuclear power purposes. So what are they doing? Their so-called space program is a missile program, trying to figure out a delivery system. So I think we know what they're doing. Now, whether they're going to stop at that proverbial, turn of the screwdriver at the threshold because they don't want to get bombed by the United States, or whether they're going to go the whole way, I mean, we don't know. And I don't think of this situation. The Iranian nuclear program has just been hit by the United States. And the supreme leader says, okay, so much for the fatwa. Now I'm the so-called fatwa. Now we're going for a nuclear weapon. Well, first of all, they don't have the right to do that. They have agreed under various guises not to do that, but they would say, well, now we've been attacked. Suppose that the United States then says, 5 presidents have said, you're not going to get a nuclear weapon. Is that credible? That we have just bombed. It sure is credible. The old Ed Koch line, mug them again. I mean, if they say we're going to now race to build a bomb, I'm confident that under those circumstances, the president would say, well, then you're going to get hit again. You're not going to get a nuclear weapon. So I think the debate in the administration, if these negotiations don't go well, will be over the question of what does a strike mean. And by that I mean, is the analogy here Soleimani? Okay, it's not one strike, but you know, it's a couple of days. It's not war. It's not sending Americans to Iran. It's over in a couple of days. Or is it war? And I think you can see people in the administration, for example, the vice president, saying to the president, it's a war in the Middle East. You're going to turn yourself into George W. Bush. It's exactly what you ran against. And others in the administration saying, no, it's not. It's like Soleimani. And all of your supporters will understand, you know, this is American power, American strength, and you keep your word. Where does Trump come out? No way to know, but I think we do know that the people who are more likely to take that latter view, the National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, are decreasingly, it would seem, decreasingly influential in the administration.
But we're full of questions. How desperate are the Iranians for a deal? How seriously constrained has been their economy because of the sanctions that have been posed? And what is the connection between economic constraint, whatever deprivation is caused by the sanctions, and their drive to obtain nuclear weapons capability? Have we been able to contain their ambition to have a weapon with all of the sanctions that have been imposed? So first of all, how terrible is the situation, and what's the connection between a supposedly terrible situation and their ambition for a nuclear weapon?
The Iranian economy is not doing well. It has, frankly, rarely been doing well since 1979, thanks in part to the fact that the state effectively took over all private enterprise and still to this day really dominates all aspects of the Iranian economy. There was a period of time between the late 90s and leading up to the nuclear deal in which there was more opportunity, more economic growth, a post-revolutionary baby boom that was coming to the fore and introducing innovation and a little bit of dynamism. And I think that was what the 2015 deal was intended to capitalize on. Obviously, it didn't come to pass, and what has happened since the imposition of maximum pressure, which has not been at maximum levels since at least 2021, has been a shrinking of Iran's middle class, a worsening of the brain drain and capital flight from the country, and a growing sense of depoliticization and desperation among Iranians. I don't know that extends to the regime itself. The value of the currency has plummeted. It is 1/10 of what it was 10 or 20 years ago. It has been cut in half even in just the past year, although it bounced back up again as soon as the negotiations were announced. But what worries me about the efficacy of sanctions with respect to Iran is several things. Number one, they've been dealing with sanctions since November of 1979, the first really strenuous measures that were enacted after the seizure of the US Embassy and the holding of Americans hostage. And they have learned to evade and to work around and to manage through sanctions pressure over those 46 years. Number two, we have evidence that the regime can continue all of its bad behavior even at the lowest points of its economic vitality. So, for example, during the long war between Iran and Iraq, the Iranian economy was in far more desperate conditions than it is today, and they still managed to begin to revive their nuclear program and to invest in a nascent then network of proxies, including Hezbollah, and do some of the worst attacks on their neighbors, even at a time of tremendous economic pressure. And the final point that, as someone who wrote a 600 or 700 page book on the Iranian political economy, there's really no evidence that the regime is conditioned to behave in ways that are in the best interests of its own people. And so it absolutely would be in the best interests of Iranians to open up, to end this hostility to the United States and to Israel, and to create more opportunities for this generation that really needs to be brought into the workforce in a productive way. But the regime has always prioritized ideology over those interests.
So,
I mean, if you think of the regime doing a real deal, that is, think of the regime doing a deal that allows for the end of U.S. sanctions, There are no more U.S. sanctions. That means that, for example, they stop, it's not just nuclear, it means they stop supporting all the terrorist proxies, like the Houthis. And it means that they agree to some limits on the missile program. And there's a real opening, a kind of normalization with the U.S. You can even think of, you know, U.S. trade, U.S. investment, maybe an exchange of embassies. That's great for the Iranian people, but what's left of the regime ideologically? I mean, that, you know, the old Kissinger line, they have to decide between being a nation or a cause. Well, it's obvious that the Iranian people want a normal nation, but for those in the regime, they don't want that. I mean, then what is the excuse for this vicious and brutal dictatorship and for spending money on things that have nothing to do with the people of Iran? So I think if we go far with this, it's a real challenge to the regime, and they're not going to do it. I mean, you know, what is the regime? What is it? Death to America, death to Israel, repression of women, the hijab. You start eliminating that, there's no excuse for them to be there.
Your comments really provoked some thoughts, Suzanne, both of you actually. But Suzanne, based on what you were saying earlier about essentially Iran being able to eat sand while sanctions are imposed and continue on their drive for weapons capability and everything else, missile program, proxies, is even the concept of maximum pressure just futile?
I think maximum pressure would be difficult to reimpose, although we've seen some incremental progress since the Trump administration came back into office. But fundamentally, what happened in 2018 when President Trump first left the deal was very much a condition of uncertainty around the wider international community. So I think the Iranians anticipated that the Europeans would continue to do business with them because they opposed the president's decision at that time. What they didn't appreciate was that the way that the sanctions are constructed relies on compliance by financial institutions, and effectively there were no European banks that were going to countenance being exposed to American sanctions if they did business with Iran. And so the Europeans couldn't do business with them. But there were other parties, particularly the Chinese, that stood back and actually ended their importation temporarily of Iranian oil because they weren't entirely sure how this would play out. And so they watched and they waited. And then toward the very last days of the first Trump administration, they began to ramp up their oil imports, mainly through small refiners that weren't exposed to the US financial system. And what they've done since that time is really provide a lifeline to the Iranian economy by importing the vast majority of somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million barrels a day that Iran exports today. That is what has enabled the Iranians to stay afloat. And I see no evidence that the Chinese are prepared to adhere to American sanctions, to voluntarily ramp down their imports. And I also see very little efficacy of American sanctions because so much of the Chinese economy now is already beginning to decouple from the American economy. And so I think, you know, we just don't have the ability to impose maximum pressure on those third parties, and it is those third-party countries, particularly Russia, China, but also Russia, that have managed to enable Iran to sustain itself.
I'm a little more optimistic about it, and the reason is that you have snapback. If the American position to the Europeans were, please do snapback, there are a lot of countries, in Europe, for example, that will abide by the UN sanctions. So that escape route would be gone. And there are other countries, countries like Japan, South Korea, that would not violate the UN sanctions. China would, again, through these so-called tin pot refineries and all, but if you've got the UN sanctions back on, UN sanctions that China and Russia are theoretically abiding by, it does hurt the Iranians, who are now giving 95% of their oil to China. They got to sell at a big discount. And the Chinese are going to say, we have you over a barrel, we are your only customer, nobody wants to touch you. So the discount becomes larger and larger. because the Chinese want to make money. Their economy is under pressure as well. And that means less money comes into Iran, and nobody's investing. I mean, FDI, foreign direct investment in Iran, is low, and obviously the reimposition of UN sanctions would keep it low. So then the question, I think, for the people in the regime is, how bad is this? I mean, Suzanne, I think, is certainly right that you know, they've survived this kind of thing before, but it gets harder, and we've seen uprising after uprising every 5 years. It gets harder, and the regime is aware of this. We've seen them, for example, loosen up at times on the hijab question when the supreme leader thought the people are getting really riled up. And so my view is, do it. Put the maximum pressure on, and let's see what we can squeeze out of the regime.
With ramped up sanctions on transportation, on insurance for shipping, is it possible to totally choke off the supply of Iranian oil to China? Would that require military means, or
no,
is there...
it's not possible to choke it off. I mean, they're exporting now in small tankers that go primarily to the waters off Malaysia. And then tankers are relabeled, renamed, or the oil is transferred to a different ship, which never went to Iran, and then goes on to China. Yeah, we could do more about this. I mean, we could certainly, I would say, squeeze shippers, insurers, ship captains harder. We could squeeze the Malaysians, which it's my impression we have not done. And by the way, I don't think we did it under Trump in the first term either, really. But we could try doing that too. So would we eliminate the supply to China? No. And by the way, it's 95% of what Iran is exporting. It's not 90% of what China is importing. The Chinese could get along without it. So we could squeeze the Iranian economy more. And I don't know why we're not doing it, particularly now when we're in a negotiation. You want to squeeze them. You want to get the best terms you can. That's what we should be doing.
Suzanne, let me ask you a little bit more about sort of internal issues in Iran. Does Iranian politics matter? Are there different strains within the Iranian leadership that might be moving in a more pragmatic direction? Can we rely on a next generation? There has been a brain drain, a flight from Iran from many of the most enlightened and educated of the Iranian population, but certainly within the population there are people who are smart and capable and would like to move the country in a different direction. Do they have any power to do that?
I'll take your last question first. No. Unfortunately, people who would like to see even gradual, even modest change to the regime's ideology and grip on power have largely been made irrelevant. There was a brief moment in history where there was, and it is true that Iranian politics matters, because we've seen at times there have been movements such as the one that came to the fore in the late 1990s that did try to nudge Iran in a slightly more reform-oriented direction. They were beaten at every turn. They were largely forced from office, and those that remain, including the current president of Iran, who comes from the reformist party that was dedicated to trying to expand democratic norms and institutions in the late 1990s, are now wholly owned subsidiaries of the regime ideology and the commitment to the absolute authority of the supreme leader. It's very dangerous to have a kind of unitary executive theory in a theocracy. And so, I think what we've seen is that the politics of change from within the system get blocked by those who control the judiciary, those who control the security forces, and who are unwilling to compromise in any significant way. And so the question really will inevitably be some kind of change from outside of the governing system itself. And as you say, we've seen, and as Elliott noted, we've seen many instances of fairly significant public protest within Iran that has become much more nihilistic, much more opposed to any strain of continuing the regime itself. But none of those uprisings have led to systemic change. None of them appear to have produced a political movement that could, go up against the current regime, and none of them have convinced key elements of the regime that their future doesn't lie within trying to preserve the regime. What happened in 1979 with the revolution was both a revolution on the streets, but also a collapse of the will of the security forces and of the monarch himself to try to retain his hold on power. This regime, the Islamic Republic, is determined. There's no sign that the security forces are wavering, and there isn't that really well-organized, coherent group that is pushing for change from outside the system.
Elliott, in the first Trump administration, there was talk, certainly within the administration, but outside the administration, about ways in which the United States could play a more active role in kind of encourage regime change, if we can put it very bluntly. Is there a practical way in which the United States can facilitate these forces that Suzanne is talking about? And have we tried, and what can we try going forward?
We've tried. I would say we haven't done enough. In the you may remember in the uprising of 2009, President Obama was essentially silent and has now said, I made a mistake. I got that wrong. I should have said more. And I think that is a signal to us, yes, moral support, political support, verbal support on the part of Western democracies is important. We should be doing what we can to help the Iranian people get access to the internet. And we've done some of that. I'm frankly uncertain of whether we're continuing to do it, because the Trump administration is kind of taking apart those aspects of the American government. We have Radio Farda, which is the Persian language broadcasting. Okay, there are other Persian language broadcasters from Israel, from Europe, from Los Angeles, that are listened to in Iran. But we did have both Voice of America and Radio Farda. And God knows where those stand now. This is a huge mistake, not just for Iran, but for Russia, for China, for Cuba, to eliminate those broadcasters. So we don't have the ability, I think, to foment an uprising in Iran. We have the ability to help the Iranian people and show them we're on their side. And I do fear that actually, if you compare, let's say, the end of 2025 with 2, 3, 5 years before, we're going to actually be doing much less of that, because the Trump administration seems to have a kind of allergy to doing what it considers to be regime change activities. These are not regime change activities. These are and have been since 1945 ways of expressing the views, the ideals, the hopes of the United States, the American people, and it's just a tragedy that the administration is weakening those institutions.
There seems to be a whole allergy to soft power tools in general. Yeah. Suzanne, you wanted to jump in on this.
I wanted to give one very specific example of how Voice of America and Radio Farda and some of the other tools that we have actually, I think, had some direct impact on Iran. There was an Iranian journalist who left the country, fled after the 2009 uprising over the rigged re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. She came to the United States, eventually developed a radio program on Voice of America, and her particular interest was in Iranian women. Her name's Masih Alinejad. She's still a broadcaster. She's actually someone the Iranian regime has tried to assassinate in New York City. She started a radio program where she encouraged women to wear white hijab as a signal of their opposition to enforced hijab, not veiling as a concept in Islamic law, but just the idea that the regime forced it on people. She then encouraged people to take pictures of themselves without wearing their hijabs. I will say, I'd be tarred and feathered by the Iranian diaspora if I gave her credit for what happened in 2022 in terms of the uprising that happened after Mahsa Amini was killed. But she understood something that most outside, sort of watchers of Iran did not understand. She understood how much the veil and the mandate to wear a veil was resented, not just by women, because it's uncomfortable in hot weather, and it's probably, as someone who's worn hijab in Iran, Iran, I can tell you. But also by men who understood that when their wives, their sisters, their nieces, their friends went out on the streets, they could never be certain that they were secure because they could always be harassed by someone, either official or unofficial, who didn't like how much hair they were showing or whether they were dressed in a certain way. And so, you know, that radio program was, I think, a beacon of light from this country, from someone who understood Iran, who was able to use a very small amount of money from the US government. And that, I believe, did contribute to a growing awareness and opportunity, and Iranians seized it in the aftermath of Mahsa Amini's death. And it is that moment that we might miss the next time because we are apparently no longer committed to those kinds of resources.
Yeah, I think we'll push that hard. Thank you. Let me turn in a slightly different direction. Some of the Iranian regime's most active terrorist entities and proxies face sanctions and legal restrictions in a number of countries. Others do not. Hezbollah, which launched 10,000 rockets, missiles, and mortars into Israel beginning shortly after October 7th, is designated a terrorist entity in full or in part in more than 60 countries. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is designated by just the US, Israel, and Canada, although moves are gaining steam in the European Union to join that list. With the evidence of Iranian agents and proxies, terrorist acts, and threats across Europe so clear, why is progress on terrorism designation internationally so slow? Elliott.
Well, part of it is fear of Iran. I think there is a sense that also that Iran is moving. This is really a terrible development in a way. It's hard to train an IRGC terrorist, right? Years of training, then you have to put that person into Europe, make sure that he or she knows how to commit these acts, and without being discovered as an Iranian agent, and they have to be able to get out of the country. There's an easier way to do it that Iran is now beginning to employ more often, which is hire criminals. Pay a criminal gang to commit these acts of terrorism, and then the Iranian hand is, you know, or any other government that wants to do it this way, China, Russia, anybody else. This is something that, by the way, we need to worry about a lot in the United States as well. But I think part of this is certainly the fear. We don't want to get into a tangle with a terrorist regime and a terrorist group, the IRGC, because of what they'll do here in Germany or whatever country it is. And I wonder if there's been a sufficient amount of pressure from the United States and the others who have designated. We could certainly use more of that. The problem now is, in part, you know, our relations with many other countries, including the European allies, are very tense right now, and our ability to have that influence is probably less than it was previously.
Do you want to jump in?
I just echo the importance of transnational repression and combating it by authoritarian states. I mean, this is not just an Iran problem, but it is a very specific Iran problem that we have, I think, failed to focus on. There was a period of time where Iran got out of the business of trying to assassinate its critics and dissidents abroad. I mentioned a kind of reform moment in the late 1990s. That was one of its only achievements, and it didn't last very long. The regime went back to that kind of activity with threats against foreign diplomats in Washington, with threats against dissidents, with threats against US government officials, including President Trump and those who served in his first administration. That's a really insidious and dangerous tactic to deploy, and whether they're using their own people or whether they're using third country nationals, you know, I think it's something that we have to be more alert to, both with respect to Iran, but also China, Russia, and other really dangerous states.
If I just say, they haven't really paid a price for all of what Suzanne is saying. I mean, they've done this. I think you could say Putin hasn't really paid enough of a price either for his assassination attempts and assassinations. It's amazing if you think about it, right? Assassination plots against the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, against the president. I mean, I would have thought, you know, we just send a message to the Iranians. If any people are killed, you, the Supreme Leader, you're a dead man walking. You're gone. I don't think we've sent that message.
I've got lots more questions, but I suspect that there are some questions in the audience. I'm going to ask one more now, but formulate your additional questions as well. I want to go back to snapback, which you referred to earlier. Any party of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal has until October 18th of this year to trigger the reimposition of UN sanctions on Iran that were lifted following the deal's implementation. And there are indications that France, Germany, and the UK, and I believe even President Macron said something to this effect just in the last 24 or 48 hours, those three countries are inclined to take that step, we understand, referred to as snapback in light of Iran's serial violations of the deal's limits on its nuclear program and Iran's strict restrictions of effective international monitoring of its nuclear program. What will be the fallout of snapback, and how do you expect Iran will react? Elliott, begin with you.
Well, I don't think they'll do it if the United States asks them not to do it. That's the thing to worry about. I do think they're inclined to do it. President Macron said it. I don't think there'd be any problem getting the new German Chancellor or the British Prime Minister to do it. If it's the position of the United States that, for example, this would help us. This would help in the negotiations, if there are negotiations by then. And the window is closing. It's May, June. You really want to do this by July. You've got maybe 10 weeks to get this done. The interesting question, I think, is what would be the Chinese and Russian reaction? It's clearly legitimate for Britain, France, Germany to do this as parties.
And it can't be vetoed.
It can't be vetoed. The setup is it instantly goes back into effect. And it's binding on everybody, including Russia and China. So do they try to weasel out of it, or do they say they'll comply but cheat, which is more likely, I think. But it will have an impact on the Iranian economy. It will close off the possibility of eliminating sanctions except through a negotiated deal with the U.S.
I mean, does it make the Iranians say, God damn you guys, I'm leaving these negotiations? Or do they say, we have to be back in negotiations? How do you read that?
I don't read it as, it puts, it squeezes them, and it seems to me that it makes it more likely that they want a deal. Now, if there is no deal, if, let's say, June 15th, the United States says, okay, negotiations have failed, we're out, we're done, this is a joke. The Iranians are playing for time. We want to see snapback. British, French, Germans do it. At that point, it would strike me that the Iranians going through whoever, the Qataris, the Swiss, start putting out feelers for a new round of negotiations, because what they see around the corner is an American strike or an Israeli strike with American support.
What do you think, Suzanne?
Well, I think, a couple of things. One is the position of the Europeans really reflects a sense of frustration, frankly, with the Biden administration, and the sense that the Biden administration was turning a blind eye to the, increasing stockpile that Iran was building, the other elements of its program that had gone far beyond what was required under the deal. And of course, the Biden administration had been trying to negotiate a successor deal, and then when that became obviously impossible, they decided to try to negotiate a de-escalation with Iran. And this, I think, underscores how complex the Iran challenge is and how difficult it is to try to solve one piece of it in isolation, because they did get a de-escalation from Iran over the course of 2023. They managed to, there were fewer attacks on U.S. forces in the region. They managed to produce the release of a number of Americans who'd been held completely unjustly in Iranian prisons, in some cases for as long as 8 years. But of course, they also did not manage to prevent Iran from continuing to fund Hezbollah and Hamas, and the consequences or the limitations of de-escalation were horrifically obvious on October 7th. So the Europeans have been frustrated, I think, with the American focus on the terms of the deal and trying to get back to some kind of real constraints on Iran's nuclear program. And this is why they've been pushing for snapback even before the Trump administration came back into office. I think it's a useful good cop, bad cop, but the Iranians are also very skilled at trying to play that divide. They're trying to, sort of bring the Europeans into the negotiating process with the Trump administration. I also have a very open question about how both the Russians and Chinese would react, because I think, I spent 10 days in China earlier this month. The Chinese position is we abide by the agreement that we concluded in 2015. You're the ones who walked away. It's your problem. We don't need to change our behavior. You need to change your behavior. They're not inclined to cooperate, and I suspect they'd be less inclined to cooperate. And I do wonder about what it says for the future of the UN Security Council, but that's an open question anyway.
Next session. I think we have some hands in the air. I see lots of hands. Begin with you, Sherman. I think you need to get a microphone. Sherman, one second. Let's get you a microphone. No,
here it is.
you can't take mine.
We discussed this briefly at the meeting yesterday, and I had two thoughts. One is, I think Iran can out-negotiate us by a mile. They want to have, and it's been agreed to, that they can have peaceful nuclear development, but they don't want the bomb. Well, the best way to make the bomb is not by enriching uranium. The best way is to make nuclear reactors that can create plutonium, and then it's very easy and very fast to mass produce large numbers of nuclear bombs. So I think they've got a plan in mind, and nothing's going to stop them from getting a nuclear bomb other than a direct attack. Now, we've been accused that a direct attack would destabilize the Middle East. However, Israel, the only reason even people are talking to Iran now is Israel's attack on Hamas, Israel's attack on Hezbollah, Israel's attack on Iran, which was a daring attack that went against all advice, has actually stabilized the Middle East. And it's estimated that we have 2 months in which we really could take advantage of Iran's weakness and totally destroy their nuclear weapons and maybe also their ballistic missiles. So I don't understand why there's all this talk about talks and why we aren't planning a more effective combined attack between Israel and the United States to just once and for all destroy their nuclear program.
Thank you, Sherman. Let's get a response to that before we go on to other questions.
This may be a place where Elliott and I differ a little bit. I think one of the reasons why we should be concerned about the temptation to go for a strike on Iran's nuclear program is, as we've already said, it's not clear it would fully eradicate or permanently set back Iran's nuclear ambitions. Number two, we know the Iranians would retaliate. They would retaliate against our partners and allies across the region. They'd retaliate in ways that would have devastating impact on the global economy. And I think that the consequences of that would be quite profound for all of us. And the third is that they would inevitably push for nuclear weapons capability even faster. There would be, because we don't know what we don't know, there's likely that there would be both personnel and facilities that we would be incapable of eliminating. And we would have, as I think the Speaker of the Parliament said today, an absolute eruption of chaos across the Middle East. I don't think it would be a destabilizing outcome. I think it would be. I think it would be a very destabilizing, not a stabilizing outcome.
Elliott?
Yeah, we don't know what the outcome would be, right? Let's postulate that, but I'm inclined to think it would be less catastrophic. The Israeli strike on Iraq's nuclear program didn't have that impact in the region. The Israeli strike on Syria's nuclear program didn't have that impact. What would the Iranians do? What did they do after the killing of Soleimani? Not much. Would they attack American targets like a carrier in the Gulf or an American base, let's say in Qatar or the Emirates? That's suicidal for the regime. I think it's very unlikely. What do you think the American reaction would be if they hit an American base and killed 100 American soldiers? They're not going to do that. They will try to attack Israel. The Israelis know that. And some missiles or drones are likely to get through. The ability to hit 100% of them, knock them down, is very unlikely. But I would think that an Israeli or American strike would be accompanied by a message to Tehran that, look, we have just struck the nuclear targets because you guys were moving toward a bomb. We did not strike political targets to decapitate the regime. We did not strike economic targets to make it impossible for you to export oil. We did not strike military targets. If your reaction to this is too crazy, we will. You try to attack Americans or you try to attack Saudi oil targets, then we will attack your oil targets. So you face a very difficult decision now. You're on the back foot. How much more damage to Iran do you want? And I would think that's a reasonably persuasive line, because what's the main goal of the people running the country? Regime survival, as always. Same in Russia, same in China. And that would threaten regime survival. So again, we're predicting here, and it's obvious that we can't predict with any degree of certainty. But it seems to me that the day after such a strike, international oil prices would jump from the current, whatever it is, $70 a barrel, would double, it might triple. The question is, how long would it stay there? And I don't think it would stay there very long, because I think the options open to Iran are actually not good.
We could go back and forth, I think, but instead of that, let's take a few more questions, I think all together, and then we'll ask, and then we'll ask the two, not debaters, our two speakers to respond to them. Please, let's get 3 questions in a row, please.
Yes, thank you. So we've heard all of the reasons why sanctions since the 1970s, 80s, 90s have been ineffective. You've outlined some of the problems with a direct military attack. So both of you have been advisors to presidents. If you were asked to make a recommendation today whether we should do a military attack now or continue negotiations, what would your advice be?
Hold up. Other questions that I see? I see a hand in the back of the room.
So on the note of Iranian-United States deals, as I'm sure many of us are aware of, in 2023, the Biden administration facilitated a deal in which 5 United States American hostages were released in exchange for 5 Iranian prisoners and the unfreezing of $6 billion in assets. A lot of people have criticized that sets a bad precedent for future deals. In your opinion, how does that affect the mindset and framing of future deals with Iran, and what does that say to United States deal making?
Thank you. Oh,
I'm sorry.
we're here?
Where are you?
Here, Jason, thanks.
Please.
If I'm not mistaken, I also heard yesterday that Saudi Arabia, for instance, is also in the regional Abrahamic Accord, and the Abrahamic Accord partners have a view. How would this, it was my understanding that, for instance, Saudi Arabia is putting pressure on our government not to do anything because of the stability in the region. So what has been the feeling to our government from both the Abrahamic partners and other partners in the region?
Thank you. And then
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on what you were just saying in terms of the reaction from Iran if there was a strike. So you mentioned that there would be, you disagree on the degree of instability that would create, But I just wanted to hear your opinion about the original argument against a strike, that this would just simply either cause Iran to rush for a bomb or delay the fact because Iran already has the knowledge and the supply lines, and they could rebuild the program in a few years.
You know, I'm feeling generous. Is there another hand that I see? Yes, I see. Oh, I'm sorry, there are hundreds of hands. Just keep going. Off to in that side of the room.
Hi, I was just wondering, what kind of challenges do you think Iran's membership of BRICS provides to squeezing the economy, specifically thinking about the relations with those powers like Brazil and India, who kind of try and play both sides a little bit?
Okay, and then I think final question here. I see, is that Alan's hand? Yes. Second row, yeah. I hope you guys are taking notes because they're coming thick and fast here. Okay.
I toured Iran for about 2 weeks, about 13 years ago. And what I saw was the greatest fear of the government was the people, not Israel, not the U.S. And we keep on, administration after administration, we put regime change off to the side and we say we're not going to do that. But that's truly what their government's afraid of. And it seems like there's a lot more we could do in that area. A third or 40% of the country is minority. I mean, there are a lot of areas that they're afraid of, and maybe we should take a hard look at this.
Okay, I think we'll go to the answers to the, I'm sorry, I had to stop at some point. Let's see if we can get some responses from our speakers. Who would like to begin? Suzanne?
Yes, I will try to start. Those are great questions and to some extent overlapping. So let me try to take them in no particular order, but just as I wrote them down. The hostage for cash deal of 2023 is consistent with most of the negotiations that we've done with Iran since the deal that freed the original hostages. The Americans were held in the embassy. You know, what we have to threaten Iran with typically is financial pressure, and so in many cases we have transacted lives for financial resources to Iran. It's very, very problematic and discomforting, and I think it certainly breeds more seizures of Americans. I am a little biased in this case because one of those who was released in September 2023 was a longtime friend who was held for 8 years, having done absolutely nothing wrong, detained on the day that they agreed to the nuclear deal in 2015 and only released in September of 2023. And so, you know, the humane consequences, the human consequences of you know, our estrangement and this regime are quite real. And so I think sometimes we have to do deals with the devil because we need to save American lives. In terms of the role of the BRICS, I think it's, you know, it's a way that we see the world order shifting, but I don't think that the BRICS at this point are really a competitor to the industrialized world. What it will look like in 20, 30 years, especially if we continue to alienate our friends and allies, may be quite different. But at this point, membership in the BRICS isn't really doing much for the Iranian economy. The Saudis, in particular, have made it very clear that they're opposed to a strike on Iran. They're gambling on, you know, a transformation of their economy, which requires a peaceful region. It's one of the many reasons why they're very eager to have a different relationship with Israel and to normalize just as soon as they possibly can. But they believe that a strike would have severe regional consequences and make it impossible for them to affect this economic transformation, which is why you've seen these sort of dramatic moves, including the visit of the Saudi defense minister to Tehran on the eve of the talks with the United States. And I think that is a factor that we need to take into account. With respect to a strike, you know, sort of there were a couple of questions about a strike and really the kind of pointed one about what I would advise if I were in a position to advise. I think that anyone who contemplates a strike on Iran's nuclear program has to understand it's not going to be an Israeli action alone. It's going to be a joint American and Israeli action, and it's going to lead to a reasonable possibility of a very severe and potentially protracted war in the Middle East. And if we are prepared to go down that route again, then we should strike. If we are not prepared, as I believe this current American president and the previous American president were not prepared to do, then we should not either join a strike or wink and nod to the Israelis that they should strike on their own, because it cannot be done without American support, and the after effects will draw in the United States whether we like it or not. And the final point, just on regime change, I think that is the great hope of all Iranians and the region and the wider world. The difficulty is that we have been not terribly deft at affecting regime change in ways that leaves more positive outcomes in the aftermath. And so I think, finding ways that we can support indigenous efforts of Iranians to try to produce a better outcome for their own country and their own people is probably the most useful work that we can be doing.
Elliott?
We agree on a lot of those answers. I do think the president, as I think I said before, will on his forthcoming trip to the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Emirates, will be hearing, as Suzanne said, don't do it. They want calm. They're afraid of an Iranian counterstrike. They're very, very vulnerable. So he will be hearing that. I agree on the hostage thing. It's terrible. I mean, it's easy to say in the abstract, we should not do these deals. Because it's true that the lesson we teach Iran is, this is a great piece of your bizarre commerce, right? You take hostages, we pay for them. On the other hand, then you meet, it's what the Israelis are going through, and Suzanne and I have seen it on Iran, you meet with the families. And how do you say to them, well, sorry for your pain, but there are larger issues here. You can't do that. And so we all keep paying. What would I say about a strike? Here, I'll just end with this. Here we disagree. I never used to suggest a strike, because what I used to say, particularly to Israelis, was I don't live in Tel Aviv. I live in Washington. Nobody's going to send missiles and bombs and drones to my house. The fear was Hezbollah. That fear is really gone. The Israelis have, in essence, eliminated that ring of fire. And the threat to them exists. There's no question that Iran will try, but it is a much diminished threat. I don't think that the aftermath is a Middle Eastern war. I don't think, because the Middle Eastern war, what? Jordan, which is now cracking down on the Muslim Brotherhood, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria? No, I don't think so. And I think it's true that if Israel strikes, the United States would be deeply involved in helping defend Israel, as we were a couple of years ago in the Biden administration. I don't see why it spreads and becomes a Middle Eastern war. I see the utility for Iran in trying to do that. But I think the United States can make plausible threats. Now remember, we're in the aftermath of a strike, and the United States is now saying, think about your response, because your response can destroy your economy and bring down the regime. Think twice. And I think the Iranians have shown in their reactions previously to Israel, to the killing of Soleimani, that go back to Reagan days when President Reagan largely destroyed their Navy, 1988, that they think about these things carefully and they think about regime survival. So again, with the caveat, once a military strike happens, you're predicting, but you can't be sure what will happen. It seems to me that there is an opportunity this year to change the Middle East by eliminating the Iranian nuclear program. Yes, it is true that the surviving scientists can rebuild. But remember, again, 5 presidents have said to them, you are doing this in vain. you're never going to get a nuclear program. We will strike if we have to prevent it. In the aftermath of a strike, that's an even more credible threat. And as we saw in the case of Iraq and Syria, it ended the nuclear program because they took the threat seriously. So it seems to me that, again, having in mind also Putin and Xi Jinping, that an American strike would actually reestablish the sense that the United States really does care about maintaining some form of rules in the international system and cannot be ignored.
Elliott, thank you. Suzanne, thank you. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I think as enlightening as we were hoping it would be. I thank you for your patience with us and your and the rich information that your experience and your knowledge brought to this conversation. Thank you. Thank you all for being part of this.